Nobody at St. Michael's Trauma Center remembered the exact day nurse Sarah Bennett started. She simply appeared one Monday morning, quietly clocking in before the sun rose, quietly restocking supply carts, quietly disappearing into the chaos of the ICU like she'd always been part of the walls. She never joined the gossip circles by the coffee machine. She never complained about double shifts. She never talked about her life outside the hospital, and when anyone asked, she'd offer a soft smile and change the subject so smoothly you wouldn't even notice you'd been redirected. Dr. Marcus Webb, the head trauma surgeon, had worked beside her for 8 months and still couldn't have told you where she lived, whether she had family, or what she did on her days off. She was competent, more than competent, if he was honest with himself. Her hands never shook during the worst traumas. Her voice never wavered when a patient's heart stopped. She moved through emergencies with a calm precision that some of the younger nurses found almost unsettling, like she'd seen far worse than anything a Tuesday night in the ER could throw at her. But competence wasn't charisma, and in a hospital full of loud personalities and louder egos, Sarah Bennett faded into the background like wallpaper. People trip over the quiet ones. They assume quiet means small. They assume the person who says the least has the least to say. That was the mistake everyone at St. Michael's made about Sarah every single day for 8 months without ever knowing it. She carried herself like someone who had learned a long time ago that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible, that the ones who talked the least in dangerous situations were often the ones who lived to walk away from them. There was a discipline in the way she folded linens, in the way she checked vitals twice without being asked, in the way her eyes swept a room before she entered it, cataloging exits without even realizing she was doing it anymore. Old habits, deeply worn grooves, the kind that don't come from nursing school. But nobody noticed. Nobody asked. Hospitals are busy places, and busy people rarely look twice at someone who never asks for attention. That particular Thursday started like any other. The ICU was short-staffed, 2 nurses out with the flu, and Sarah had already worked a 10-hour shift with barely a break. She was refilling a saline drip in room 214 when the first sound reached her. A deep rhythmic thumping that most people in the building mistook for construction equipment or maybe a passing storm. Sarah's hand stopped moving. Just for a second. Just long enough that if anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen something shift behind her eyes, some old instinct rising to the surface like a diver breaking for air. She knew that sound. She knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, the way you know a voice you haven't heard in years, but would recognize instantly in a crowded room. It was a Black Hawk, and it was close. Dr. Webb was the first to reach the window, drawn by the growing rumble that now had the entire trauma wing buzzing with confused speculation. Nobody called ahead about a military transport. There was no mass casualty alert, no emergency briefing, nothing in the system indicating incoming personnel. And yet there it was, unmistakable, descending toward the hospital's helipad with the kind of controlled, deliberate precision that spoke of years of training, dropping altitude in a slow spiral before leveling out for final approach. The nursing staff crowded the windows of the West Wing. Phones raised, whispers spreading through the hallway faster than any page over the intercom system ever could. Sarah remained in room 214, finishing the saline line, her movement steady but her jaw tight, her shoulders squared in a way that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. Something in her posture had changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a soldier hearing reveille after years of civilian sleep. When she finally stepped into the hallway, for soldiers in full combat gear were already making their way through the sliding glass doors of the main entrance, their boots striking the polished floor in unison, their faces set in the particular stillness of men executing a task they considered sacred. Behind them walked a 5th man, older, gray at the temples, his uniform decorated with the kind of insignia that made even the hospital's security guards straighten their spines instinctively. He moved like a man used to rooms falling silent around him. Dr. Webb stepped forward, already forming the question every stunned face in that hallway was asking. What was a military commander doing walking into their trauma center with an armed escort and no warning? But before he could speak, before anyone could speak, the 4 soldiers stopped. In perfect, practiced unison they turned. Not toward the surgeon. Not toward the nursing station. Not toward anyone gathered near the entrance. They turned directly toward Sarah Bennett, standing quietly by room 214 with a duffel bag looped over her shoulder that nobody had noticed her carrying until that exact moment. and they raised their hands in a slow, deliberate salute. The hallway went utterly silent. Even the machines seemed to hush. Nurses who had walked past Sarah 100 times without a second glance now stared as though seeing her for the first time. As though the woman they thought they knew had simply dissolved and someone else entirely had stepped into her shoes. The gray-haired commander walked past his men, past Dr. Webb, past every stunned face in that corridor, and stopped directly in front of Sarah. He straightened his posture, snapped his own hand up in a crisp, formal salute, and in a voice loud enough for the entire wing to hear, said 3 words that would haunt every person in that hallway for years to come. "Major, welcome home." Sarah Bennett, the quiet new nurse nobody had bothered to notice, closed her eyes for just a moment, exhaled the breath she seemed to have been holding for 8 long months, and slowly, deliberately, returned the salute. If you've ever underestimated someone because they were quiet, because they didn't announce themselves, because they simply did the work without asking for credit, you already understand exactly why this story is about to change everything you thought you knew about the woman in room 214. And if stories like this move you, stories about the quiet ones who turn out to be the strongest people in the room, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will show you exactly why Sarah Bennett stopped talking about her past in the first place. The name on her chart said Sarah Bennett, RN. The name stitched into memory across 4 different combat deployments said something else entirely. Major Sarah Bennett, United States Army, combat flight surgeon, callsign Mercy, the nurse-turned-medic who had once kept an entire helicopter crew alive during an extraction gone catastrophically wrong in a valley whose name never made the news. Commander James Holloway hadn't come to St. Michael's Trauma Center by accident. He'd been searching for her for 3 months, ever since the Pentagon finally approved the ceremony that should have happened over a year ago. A ceremony delayed by red tape, by her own repeated refusals, by a woman who had quietly walked away from her military career the moment the war took something from her that no medal could replace. Holloway had served 2 tours alongside Bennett. He'd watched her operate on a dying soldier in the back of a moving Black Hawk under enemy fire, her hands never once trembling, her voice calm even as the aircraft rocked violently around them. He'd watched her pull 3 men from a burning wreckage with dislocated shoulders and 3rd-degree burns, refusing evacuation herself until every one of her patients was secure. And he'd watched the light slowly leave her eyes after the mission that took her best friend and co-pilot, Captain Ray Delgado, a loss she carried in silence because that was what she'd been trained to do. Compartmentalize, function, survive, and never, ever let the mission see you break. When she'd resigned her commission 18 months later, nobody in her unit understood why. They assumed burnout. They assumed grief. What they didn't know was that Sarah had made herself a promise standing over Ray's body in that valley, that if she survived, she would spend the rest of her life saving people quietly, without fanfare, without recognition, in whatever small way she could, because the war had taught her that glory meant nothing and that the only thing that mattered was whether the person in front of you lived or died. That was why she'd chosen civilian nursing. That was why she'd chosen to disappear into the background of an ordinary hospital, working the hardest shifts, taking the cases nobody else wanted, never once mentioning the 4 combat tours, the 4 campaign medals, or the Bronze Star with Valor that sat wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of a drawer she hadn't opened in over a year. She wanted to be invisible. She wanted, more than anything, to simply be useful without being seen. But Commander Holloway hadn't forgotten her, and the Army doesn't forget its own, especially not when a formal commendation ceremony had been sitting unresolved for over a year, waiting for a woman who kept declining to schedule it. He'd used every resource available to track her down, and when he finally found her working nights at a civilian trauma center 3 states away from where she'd grown up, he decided the ceremony wasn't coming to her on some sterile military base. It was coming to her on her turf, in front of the people she now spent her days quietly protecting. Standing in that hallway surrounded by stunned doctors and wide-eyed nurses who suddenly understood why Sarah's hands never shook during a code blue, Holloway reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet case. He opened it slowly, revealing the Bronze Star with Valor device, the metal glinting under the harsh fluorescent hospital lights. Major Bennett saved 11 lives during Operation Ember Ridge, he announced, his voice carrying down the corridor with the weight of absolute truth, including mine. She held a collapsed lung closed with her own hands for 11 minutes while under direct enemy fire, refusing extraction until every wounded soldier was aboard that aircraft. This woman is the reason 4 families still have a father, a son, a husband coming home. Dear. Webb felt his throat tighten as he looked at Sarah, at the woman he'd worked beside for 8 months, whom he'd once mildly criticized in a staff meeting for being too quiet during rounds, not understanding that her silence wasn't a lack of confidence but the deepest kind of strength, forged in places most people would never survive. The nurses who had once whispered about the strange, distant new hire now stood with tears in their eyes, finally understanding the haunted stillness they'd occasionally caught in her expression during quiet moments between patients. Sarah accepted the medal with trembling hands, the first time anyone in that building had seen her hands tremble at all, and when Holloway pulled her into a firm embrace, she allowed herself for just a moment to be seen, not as the quiet new nurse, not as a mystery to be whispered about, but as exactly who she was, a hero who had simply chosen to keep serving, long after the uniform came off, in whatever way the world needed her next. In the weeks that followed, Sarah didn't change much. She still worked the hardest shifts. She still avoided the spotlight whenever possible. But something had shifted in how the hospital saw her, and more importantly, in how she allowed herself to be seen. Not as someone hiding from her past, but as someone who had simply found a new way to honor it. Ray Delgado's photograph now sat on her small apartment desk, no longer hidden away in guilt but displayed with quiet pride, and every night before her shift, she touched the frame and whispered the same 3 words: still saving people. This is why we tell these stories, because the quietest person in the room is so often carrying the heaviest history, the deepest courage, the most extraordinary sacrifice, and they will never announce it themselves. If Sarah's story moved you even a little, hit that subscribe button right now, because our channel is dedicated to uncovering the hidden heroes walking among us every single day. The ones who never ask for recognition but absolutely deserve it. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the quiet ones are often the strongest people you will ever meet. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.